Hi, hello, bonjour, and namaste. This is Out of the Clouds, a podcast at the crossroads between business and mindfulness. And I'm your host, Anne Muhlethaler. So today, my guest is a journalist and writer called Ana Santi. Ana had various roles as a journalist, first at Drapers, a renowned UK fashion trade magazine, and later on she went in-house in a brand called Jigsaw, which, if you live in the UK, you may be familiar with, where she became their first editor-in-chief. There she launched an in-house magazine, and she even published a book called Comfort Zones, a collection of original stories by 28 women writers, including Pandora Sykes, Emma Gannon, for the charity Women for Women International. Her new book, 3 Things to Help Heal the Planet, was published earlier this year, and I was very keen to talk about it with Ana, as you'll probably notice. I really wanted to have a conversation around some of the very important topics that she covers across the 21 essays that make up the book. So in this interview, we talk, of course, about Ana's journey from her native Brazil to the UK first, what brought her to journalism. We also talk about how and why working as a fashion reporter became a launching pad towards this book to talk about sustainability and individual action. Of course, we get into the essays, the mission of the book, and among many other things, we talk about why we should learn to be a better ancestor. I hope that this intrigues you. I am very excited to be bringing you this interview. So let's get into it. Happy listening. Ana, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to Out of the Clouds.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so happy that we're seeing each other today. So as you already know, the podcast is at the crossroads between business and mindfulness. So what I normally like to is start by asking my guests to share and tell their stories quite freely instead of starting with a deep dive. So I find that it's really interesting to understand more about who we are and what motivates us before we get into the work and what we do. So I'd like to invite you to tell us who you are and where you're from.
Okay, thank you. So I feel like I should start here. I was born in Brazil and I grew up there until I was about 8.5 in a town called Santos, which is in São Paulo, in the state of São Paulo. And I had a lovely childhood. And then when I was 8.5, we moved to Bristol city in England. And from then on, that's where I grew up until I went to university just outside London, where I studied French. And I think, I don't know if this is true or not, but I wonder whether I developed sort of love for language and linguistics by arriving in a country completely unable to speak the language. I remember going to primary school. My mum had to sit next to me when I first went, which I just don't think would happen today. I don't know.
Oh my God, that's so sweet.
I know, she just sat next to me and would translate workbooks, because I could do the work. If I had like a maths textbook, I could do the maths, but I could, well, some of it anyway, but I couldn't understand the questions, like the problems being asked, for example. So yes, she almost became a bit of a teaching assistant, because then all the other children were like, oh, can you help me with this? And can you help me with that? And my mum is a teacher. So,
oh, okay. That's even better.
So I think the primary school were actually really quite chuffed that happened. They were like, oh, okay, an additional teaching assistant. So, yeah, I wonder whether my love for language and linguistics perhaps came from that. I also then remember in secondary school when we started learning French, and I couldn't speak French. I started at the same place as everybody else did, but I would know the meaning of words. That our French teacher would say, right, does anyone know what that means?
Oh.
And I was, that sound. I remember la mode. And I thought that sounds like moda in Portuguese. So I would make those connections.
Can I add something to that? I found years ago, the first time I went to visit Brazil, I was in Sao Paulo for work, and there was a whole bunch of fashion magazines because I worked in fashion. And I realized with surprise how close written Portuguese is to French.
Yeah.
And so I could understand roughly 50% of what was on the page.
Yeah.
Could not understand a word of what anyone said to me when they were speaking, though.
That is so true. And you're given a bit of time, aren't you? And it's written down rather than someone talking at you. You can sort of, read it and take your time. Remember that. So I studied French at university, language and literature, which I loved. I wish I could go back to university and just do it all over again. I love it. Love learning. I've been a bit of a geek, maybe.
Oh, I feel you.
I just saw all those books and like those reading weeks, like you'd actually get given time to just read. And at the time, I don't know whether I actually appreciated that enough, but my gosh, if I was given like a reading week now, that would be so lovely. Yes. And then after university, I moved to London because my university was just outside London anyway. And I started in PR. Even though I actually wanted to be a journalist, I was getting some advice after my university degree. And everyone said to me, well, if you want to be a journalist, you should really do a journalism course. And I thought, gosh, I've been in education. I was 22 because doing French, I spent a year abroad in France teaching. So I thought, I don't want to do more courses, more learning. I want to sort of get out there and start working. So I went into PR. I did that for 2.5 years. And then I did do a journalism course. And then I became a journalist, which I still am. That's been my career for 15 years. It's just that it has broadened out a lot more now. I freelance. So I'm not employed like I used to be. I don't write for one publication. I freelance and now I write, and I've written for and continue to write for brands. So it's a much broader piece. And I continue to live in London. I don't know if that's, I don't know if I told it freely. I don't know. I just think, when you get asked to tell your story, we do, I don't know if you find this through, all the people that you interview, whether we do seem to default to our jobs. And I really didn't want to do that. And I hope I haven't done that too much.
Not too much. Well, the fact that you shared how much you loved reading, for example, and your love of language, I think is something really interesting to note. But before we go any further, I want to already leave some of my questions and go back to your upbringing in Brazil, because I was reading last night a passage from your book, the introduction to Where. And I absolutely loved the fact that you started the chapter by saying, my Barbie was always the best dressed.
Can
you please tell us that story and tell us about your grandmother?
Yeah, oh my gosh, my Barbie looked amazing. I'm grandmother.
I'm going to request pictures because I want to see what she looked like.
Oh gosh, I wonder. Oh my gosh, do I have some? Now you've made me want to try and uncover these photos. I bet we have them somewhere. Yes, my grandmother was a seamstress. So she had a converted garage in her house in Brazil, and she made bespoke dresses, but she did wedding dresses, guest wedding dresses, but they were beautiful. And they were all done by hand. These dresses were heavy, and she would, from, the scraps of these incredibly sort of beautiful and intricate and well-made dresses, she would make dresses for my Barbie and for my sister's Barbie. Oh, I remember them all so well. There was this emerald green dress with these sort of beautiful sequins. There was this white one. I think it was sort of a jacquardy kind of fabric, but it had a sweetheart neckline and then a really full skirt that, we would spin our Barbies around when they were dancing. So yeah, she would just, and they fit the Barbie so perfectly. I think I might have said when I was writing, I'm not sure, that I wouldn't be surprised if she sort of cut them from a pattern, or she was just, so super clever. She could just make these fit so perfectly. And sister and I would have all these parties for our Barbies, and they would just arrive with these amazing dresses. And I just felt so lucky. They were bespoke. No one else had them.
That's amazing. And then you explained that every year your grandmother, whose name was Irene.
Yeah. Irene in Portuguese. But Irene.
Irene.
Yeah.
that she would treat herself to one new skirt every year, and she would like do a catwalk and everything.
Yeah, it was so cool. So my grandparents, for most of the time that we lived in Brazil, and they had this marble staircase that went from the living room upstairs, which sounds like really fancy, but you didn't have carpet in Brazil. It's too hot. So, it was sort of a necessity, but it was really, really lovely. And she would treat herself to a new skirt every year, and she would get dressed for it. So my granddad, really funny, loves a bit of drama and theatre. So we would be waiting at the bottom of the stairs, and he would announce her, and then she would really play up to it as well. She was good, and she would walk down slowly, treating it as a catwalk. And I cannot see a can of Elnet hairspray and not think of her. She just had like her hair all made up, her red lipstick. She would work it. She would walk down the staircase, really, really working it. And it would just be every year she'd treat herself, and it was always a skirt. It was never anything else. I mean, she wore other things, but skirts were her trademark.
What a gorgeous story. All right.
Yeah, she was lovely.
You're making me think of my great grandmother, who, when you say Elnet, that's who I think of. Yeah. Because she had what I like to call the helmet of older ladies, when no hair ever comes out of place because it's
incredible, isn't it?
And I think the reason why I'm thinking of her is because the one thing I have from her is one unbelievably beautiful black tie, black silk skirt.
Oh, wow.
Full length.
Oh,
and that's the only thing I have from her. Oh, no, that and a really amazing cocktail ring.
Yeah. My gran liked rings too, actually.
So, the last couple of years have not really helped me figure out where I could wear that skirt. But, here's hoping one day.
You will one day. I just think you will. Never, never, ever replace it. Never give it away.
Oh, no. No. So one of the things I wanted to ask you before we sort of move forward is, when did you realize that you wanted to write for a living?
So I knew I wanted to be a journalist. So I thought I'd clarify that more than a writer in general. I remember, I don't know if that's when I knew, but I certainly remember this moment really vividly. I must have been 14 or 15. And we had a project at school. It was a week-long project where our class had to produce a newspaper. And I remember being so excited about that project. And the teacher needed an editor and a deputy editor. And I really, wanted to do it, but I'm not, if I'm not sort of like the life and soul of a party, I'm not unconfident, but I don't think that I can sort of do everything. And I thought, I'd really like to do this. And my friends were saying, you should do it. You should do it. Put your hand up. And I said, no, I can't. And so they said, right, hands up for editor. And I didn't put my hand up, even though everyone was telling me to do it. And they said, right, who wants to be, and the class voted for who they wanted to be, but I didn't put my hand up for that. And then for deputy editor, I think it was the friend next to me shoved my hand up for deputy editor. I just put it up there. You've got to do it. And I got voted to do it. And that made me feel so good, because I wasn't sort of, like I said, the well-known kid in the class or anything like that, but they wanted me to do it. And that made me feel really good. And we did this amazing newspaper, and I got so into it. I picked my reporters, people who then the sub-editors to write headlines, and we had so much fun. And I think from that moment on, I knew I wanted to be a journalist. I don't know what led to that moment, but I do remember that sticking out for me. And I wonder also whether, what I said earlier about language and just feeling very comfortable and confident and in love with words. I just, when you find that the most perfect word to describe something, I get such satisfaction from that. And I just wonder whether that was always there as well, even if I couldn't maybe articulate it when I was younger.
It strikes me that, having more than one language is probably really encouraging you in that direction.
Yeah, because I think that obviously you can translate languages. We know that. But sometimes there are words that just work so much better in their mother tongue. Of course, you can translate anything. You can get the meaning across, but sometimes you can't quite get the feeling across, like that perfect feeling that a word in one language creates for you. So I think I've always liked to be able to read and communicate in different languages, because I think you are able to express yourself much more clearly and much more accurately if you've got the precise word to do so.
Yeah, I was going to bring you there. I was thinking there's a lot to be said about self-expression and the ability that we may have to do so. So you really did make the difference when you answered that last question by saying you wanted to be a journalist, not a writer. And yet here you are, a writer. How did that happen?
Oh, that makes me feel, if you'll allow me, like a moment of pride, because it is, it's so nice. The writer part, how did that come about? I mean, I think you'll probably agree that with my latest book, with 3 Things to Help Heal the Planet, that it does come, I think the writing does come from journalism. It does have that about it, the research behind it, the structure of it, the fact that it's nonfiction. So it does have a lot of parallels to journalism. And I think that going from journalist to writer, or not from journalist to writer, adding writer to journalism, has come from, I think, just wanting to take it further. I've been a journalist for 15 years and I feel that I'm a good journalist, and I know how to be a good journalist from everything that comes from everything that allows you to do that, and looking at the writing alone. And journalism is absolutely not just the writing, but if you do take the writing, I feel like I've done that well. And so for me, it was a question of, where do I go next? How do I keep writing? How do I keep getting that joy from writing? What else could I do? And I wanted to just explore different forms. And I think nonfiction felt like a good next step from journalism. And just also a place from where I could do more of it, in more writing. It's a real, because I love writing, it's an absolute privilege to be able to do it for a living. So I started asking myself, how can I constantly write? I got to a deputy editor when I was at Drapers Magazine, fashion trade magazine in the UK. So I left there after 9 years as deputy editor. And when you get to that kind of level at a magazine, quite rightly, you start to write less, because you manage more people and you have to be more strategic. And I enjoyed that very much. But I had to sacrifice the writing for it. And then I just wanted to write more and more and more. And so I started to think, well, how can I do that? And why not a book?
Why not a book? I just want to point out that you had the same title when you did your, was it school or high school newspaper, as the title that you had at Drapers, which is deputy editor.
Oh my gosh, do you know, I never thought of that. But yeah, you're right.
Coincidence?
What does that mean, Anne?
It's quite an arc in any case.
It is, isn't it? I never thought of that.
So, I mean, you had this wonderful career as a journalist. And then, as you mentioned, you joined a brand. You worked for Jigsaw, which not everyone outside of the UK is going to be familiar with. So we could talk about fashion and we could talk about retail, because we certainly have that in common, the two of us. And I think we probably have quite a lot of people that we know in common as well.
I bet. Yeah.
Actually, one of whom is Tamsin, who's one of the contributors to your book.
Oh, you know Tamsin as well? Oh.
Yeah, absolutely. But actually, I don't want to talk about that because I think your book is too important and I'd like us to really concentrate on this. But I was wondering if there's perhaps a bridge. And the question I had for you is, how did writing about fashion and retail prepare you to write a book about the climate crisis and the possibility of individual action?
It's a good question. So I joined Drapers as a reporter, many years ago, almost 15 years ago. And I had one of my beats was ethical fashion. One of the areas I covered was ethical fashion. At a time when ethical fashion meant very, very little to many, many people. And, I could count the number of contacts I had in one hand when it came to ethical fashion, to the point that I wonder whether it was given to me because I was the newbie. I was this junior reporter who walked in. They had to give it to somebody. Let's give it to her. Yeah. On the other side, I was also given the value sector as an area to cover. And everybody loved the value sector, like all the supermarkets who were bringing out clothing ranges. And it was so at odds with the ethical side. So I wonder whether that has always stayed with me, because I interviewed pioneers of certainly the UK at it. So I do have that knowledge, and I built that knowledge from the ground up. So I think that could have played a part in this, because in writing this book, because when it came to splitting the book into chapters, so it's split into 7 chapters, and each chapter is a part of our lives that we can do something about. And one of the chapters that was very, very easy for me to decide on was fashion. I mean, it's called Wear in the book, because every chapter is a verb, because the idea is it's for action. So, I want people to act. So every chapter is very active, but it is based on fashion. And that was probably the easiest one to write, the easiest one to get contributors for, because I knew them. Although, to be fair, one of them is someone I've met very, very recently. But yeah, I had 3 chapters to begin with, and fashion was one of them. And it was very, very natural to me to do that one.
Thanks so much. So I was wondering if you had an origin story for when you became disturbed by the lack of action with regards to the climate crisis.
I wish that I did have this sort of, epiphany, this moment that would be so easy for me to say, oh yes, it was then that it happened. But actually, I think what it was is little things and the cumulative effect of those little things that actually aren't very little at all. But when you think about them, but they were numerous rather than one big moment. I remember things like watching the news one evening, and there I was in like my living room, which is pretty comfortable on a nice sofa. And I was seeing images of the Amazon rainforest being burnt. And I'm Brazilian. I grew up in Brazil, right. and I felt very disconnected. I felt, look at me in my comfort, and look at them as in, and them, gosh, what does that even mean? I mean, you've got indigenous people living in the Amazon, and then you've got the trickle down effect of what burning those forests mean for everybody. But it was more like I was sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, this can't be right that I'm here and that's happening. I want to do something about that. What can I do? And I let that linger for a bit. And then I remember moving to where I live now in southwest London, and my daughter started a nursery, and one of the mums there said, would I want to join a local campaign group called Mums for Lungs, who are trying to raise awareness of air pollution. And she was I don't know why she asked me. I think she was just asking everybody because she was trying to canvass support. And it happened to land with me because I think partly because my daughter had suspected asthma. And then I don't know whether it was just a sort of fortuitous moment where this lady said to me, do I want to do this? And it's all these little things. And then obviously just reading about the problems. I'm a I'm a Guardian reader. So, I will.
I know what that means.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I don't know how people feel about that, but what that means in terms of this conversation is that I read a lot about environmental problems. But also, and this is, I think, what I was feeling, that I was consuming information and I was consuming newspaper articles or watching the news or listening to a podcast, but I wasn't feeling like I could do anything about it. And I was feeling like all these things that I was consuming was telling me about problems, but actually making me feel overwhelmed and anxious by them. And I didn't know where to go for solutions. I think maybe, when you asked, is there a story, a moment? I do remember this very clearly, which I think I wrote about in the book, actually. I used to, when I worked for Jigsaw, it was about 2 miles from my house. And I used to either walk or cycle to work because the public transport was ridiculous. Like, it would take ages to get there. So I would always walk or cycle. And I remember this day, it was pouring with rain. And I thought, oh God, I don't want to get wet. I'm just going to get my car. And a journey that would normally take me about 15 minutes on a bike took about 45 minutes in the car. I just sat in traffic for ages, pumping out, just horribly polluted air. And I was sitting there as these because it was obviously, on my way to work, as these school children were walking to school, carrying umbrellas. Honestly, and I started crying because I thought, one of those children will be my daughter. And I'm sitting here in the dry, pumping out my horrible fumes, while these children who they're just carrying umbrellas. Why didn't I carry an umbrella? Why didn't we all carry umbrellas? And I said to myself, I'm not doing this again because it's 2 miles away. If they can get to school with an umbrella, I think I can walk 2 miles with an umbrella, right? That was a bit of a moment for me. And I haven't done it since.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think probably the first time that we met, when we had our first conversation, I already mentioned this to you, or if I didn't, I remember very accurately the first time I really queried the system. It was in my kitchen back home where I grew up. And it was a tiny kitchen. And I remember where I was physically. I think I was doing the dishes or clearing something out after lunch. My dad was next to me. And I must have just seen the news or something, because I was confused as to why we were using chemicals in household products that would be contaminating water when we knew that we shouldn't. So a very naive 17, 18 or 19-year-old me said to my dad something like, but why doesn't the government make it illegal and just sets a rule? And I understand that there's an industry living from this, but we can give them a number of years to adapt and then they can figure out their formulations. I had a plan, you see. I wasn't just querying it. And my dad just went, yeah, that's not how this works. And I just remember looking outside the window and thinking, but why?
Why not? Yeah.
And the thing is, it must have been, I don't know, 1990, 1992. And it's been 30 years. And if I walk the aisles of my supermarket today, I would gather, this is an estimate, I could go out and count, that 80% of the brands on the shelves and the product being sold is still not good for the environment. And this leaves me wondering, what the hell are we doing? Anyways, as you are, I'm just considering at this late stage in my life, or let's say building up to starting my own family. And I think our conversation is making me wonder, why would I want to bring a child into this world if we can't get it together?
It's such I know exactly how you feel. I do have a daughter. And there were lots of discussions between my husband and I as to, and this was 8 years ago. Yeah. I only have one. One child.
I understand. You're like, yes.
Make that what you will.
Yes, I understand.
I completely know where you're coming from. And I think that, my daughter has played a huge part in where I am today with all this stuff. The book is dedicated to her. A lot of the actions I now take or don't take, I think of her. And you know what? If I think too much, I have to stop myself because it gets a bit too much. If I, and I think this is partly I don't know if problem is the right word, but certainly a consequence of working in this space is that the more you know, the more you want to find out more, but you can't unknow stuff. And some days are good days when you think that you've come across a really good solution, or you hear about work done by big groups of people, particularly young people, where you think, we could really see some change now. This is excellent. I can, I'm feeling really optimistic. But then there are other days when all I can think about is, what is life going to be like for her? What have I done? I've brought her into this world. I have partly contributed to the world that I've brought her into. And what world is she going to be living in when I'm not here anymore? And sometimes if I think about too much, I start to well up and I have to stop.
It's strange you should say that, because I was wondering about that exact thing this morning. Because if I have a child by next year, right, she'll be what, 20, she will be 24, 25, 26 by the time 2050 rolls around. Yeah. And I don't know whether you've ever come across the work of Yancey Strickler, who used to be the ex-co-founder and CEO of Kickstarter.
No, I haven't.
He's written a wonderful book. I can send you the details, called This Could Be Our Future, which I think you'll enjoy. Yeah. And he'd started this thing called the bento as a way to go beyond near-term orientation to help us make the right decisions. Right. And one of the things that I appreciate from his method, I've recently discovered different ways of explaining it through a book by Dan Pink. It's actually about selling. It's called To Sell as Human. And essentially what academics have found and scientists is that it's very hard for humans to connect to their future selves. It's almost, there's a lack of empathy that is essentially identical to a stranger. So our incapacity to project or connect to who we will be in the future is one of the reasons why we continuously seem to be making decisions that only serve us in the here and now. And I think that you probably have much stronger empathy for your child than you would even for your future self. So for people who don't have children, I could see why we continuously think about what we need right now, rather than thinking about the collective benefits or our own well-being in the future.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And you only have to look at our governments to see how true that is. Decisions are made based on the short term, based on the here and now. And I think another book that deals with that really well and is Jonathan Safran Foer's We Are the Weather, and an extract of which is in my book, in 3 Things. And even though his book is an argument against eating animal products, he goes into so much detail about that, not just in terms of what it means, but he goes into a lot of detail about what it takes for us to get there, and this idea of connecting us to the future, and how we find it difficult to believe, we find it difficult to see that there could be something really quite catastrophic happening. It just doesn't feel real. He writes very, very eloquently about those feelings and about seeing or not seeing the future and the consequences of that.
It's interesting because one of the things I wanted to ask you was disconnection. I felt like there was a very strong thread since the first pages of the book about opposing values of connection and disconnection. And actually, if I pick up his chapter, I highlighted this, and he says, when it comes to food, a major reason that stops us from making fundamental changes is our increasing disconnection to food and nature. So I'd love for you to perhaps tell me what you've learned about this disconnection and why that's a problem that we need to look at.
I completely agree. I think I would say exactly what you've said, that disconnection is such a key theme that brings all these essays together. And it comes down, I think, to the fact that we, and when I say we, by the way, I feel like I should qualify this. When I talk about we in reference to this book and what it represents more widely, is people who have a choice. So I have a choice as to where I buy my food from to some extent. I can choose what to wear. I can choose who to bank with. I have, a pretty wide choices in my life. I can make choices. So this book is for anyone who can make a choice. And so this idea of disconnection, I think, comes from the fact that we have become so comfortable. We are so used to everything just being, we talk about food quite literally. We are handed things on a plate. When you're eating your dinner, whether it's at home or in a restaurant, or if you're buying it from a supermarket, how often do you think about where that carrot originated from? How did that carrot get into your mouth? How did it, get into that meal that you're eating? Do you think about where it was grown? Do we think about who grew it? Do we think about how long it took to get to us? Do we think about everything that was used to bring that carrot to us? When we get dressed in the morning, I've got this spotty t-shirt on. Do I know who made it? Do I know if I were to break it down, what were the materials used to make it? How much water was used to make it? Did people get paid enough for it? Our banks, I mentioned I can choose who I bank with. Our global high street banks get a lot of money. What do they do with that? Do we know? Do we know the breakdown? And I think because life is so easy for so many of us, and I go back to who I identified as the we've stopped thinking. We've just become very, very comfortable. And as a result, we have become disconnected to the value of the things that we consume. We don't really think enough about how those things have landed so neatly in front of us with, seemingly no obstacles. It's just there. And it takes a lot for that carrot to land on our plate. It takes a lot for me to wear what I have chosen to wear. But I don't think we are thinking about these things enough because we've just become so used to not, and it's a habit.
Yeah. I'd like to pick up a couple of different threads from what you just said. The first one is, the other week I was interviewing a young entrepreneur in India, Nishanth Chopra. He has started an enterprise that is seed to sow. So they actually do regenerating farming, grow the cotton, work with the local weavers all the way down to the sewed product. And they have their own collections, but they now supply other sustainable or responsible brands. And he was reminding me, because he was in Milan not long ago, and that sometimes when you go to a fancy restaurant, or it could be just a, local gastropub, sometimes you have the name of the farm, or they tell you it's the potatoes are from XYZ or the whatever. And you're right. This is something that we get to experience or to see when we have choice, when we have means. But most of the time we have no idea. Also, all of the external negative things that have touched that product. Now, I grew up in the countryside in a tiny, tiny, tiny village at the back end of the county of Geneva at the border of France. And, below my house was just fields of wheat and other kind of cereals and corn. So I grew up with a dad who was much older, and he grew up in the mountains. And I had stories of they would only eat chicken once a year, and that was for the holidays. Wow. Oranges were what you would have on Christmas Eve for dessert. And that would be like a once a year kind of treat. And that certainly obviously marked me because I still remember that. And I understand the value of it. But then this is someone who then grew up, and I'm thinking of older generations as the ones least likely to want to make change, because for him, I think a meal was meat and 2 veg, probably because he came of this sense of lack. And so I was wondering, how would you imagine approaching this conversation with people who have grown up with this sense of this is what is right when it comes to food in particular?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I wish I had a really neat answer to it, because, that is a huge part of the problem, that we're all different and we all have different beliefs and values, and we don't necessarily like to be told that we're doing something wrong, which is perhaps why that isn't the best way to go into a conversation. And it's perhaps, I don't know, perhaps it's more about maybe cooking him the most delicious vegetarian meal. And saying, doesn't this taste great? And really go out of your way to make the best vegetarian meal you have ever made, and just blow him away with flavor.
I need to tell you that you're making me hungry, because it's nearly lunch here.
And that, then that becomes a bit of a conversation in itself over a nice thing. It comes from a positive place rather than you are so bad, you are doing this wrong, you are. So I don't know, we're all different, and that's that's why communication is so important. It's finding a way to talk to people. And it's partly why I've got, in my book, 21 different people, 21 very different people. I'm hoping that even if just one resonates, it's about be empathetic, be creative, be positive.
Yeah. I was going to say, one of the things that most of us forget is we are incredibly adaptable as a species. And so if we can just remind each other that actually it's not hard to change, it's how we relate to change, the stories we tell ourselves that stop us from making the change. And I can't remember the name. There was a fantastic TED talk that dates back from years ago that even went to great lengths to show how human beings have a way to rewrite their own story, to be happy with the choices they've made, even when it was hard. So essentially, we're also built in with an ability to cope and to feel good about the changes we've made. And so I became meat-free, gluten-free, and dairy-free, I'd say about 6 years ago. And apart from the fact that I'm pretty healthy, let's be honest, I've also developed an immense love of vegetables. And it's a little bit of a surprise that I love them that much. I mean, who knew I could get so creative with parsnips or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's actually possible. And I think we could all do well to remind each other that we have that capacity if only we allow ourselves to try something different.
Yeah, I completely agree. I guess the difficulty is sometimes that we are often driven to change out of necessity. And the danger is we change when the problem is already there. And this is again,
that is true.
This is another thing that Jonathan Safran Foer in his book discusses, this idea of we react when we're forced to, and we're forced to when the problem happens. We're very, very bad at preventative measures.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. But I think that we can all realize that the problem is here. I mean,
yes. Yeah.
There's an amazing book called A Beautiful Constraint. I don't remember the name of the authors. And it was showing that the more difficult the boundaries, the more creative we can be. And I think this is something that some of the people that you've interviewed and who've written in the book were talking about. But I also wanted to, actually the fridge raid frittata was one of the things that I was thinking of when we talk about creativity. But I was very interested for you to tell me a bit more about this concept of also throwing a better party. I thought that was kind of a winning, like a winning angle.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably one of my top 5 favorite lines in the book. And it was said by Tristram Stewart, who is a food waste campaigner, or anti-food waste campaigner. And he is also the first contributor. He was the first person I contacted to be part of my book. And so I'll be eternally grateful for him because he helped to kickstart the whole thing. And he embodies that mentality of being very, very positive, but realistic about what is happening, but doing something but tackling it with energy and with enthusiasm. So his mantra is, if you want to change the world, you have to throw a better party. So if you want people, the meat and 2 veg guy, and actually he had a great example of that because he said, I can't remember who the person was, but he said that someone came up to him once and said, Tristram, I've really sort of taken on board what you're saying about not eating so much meat. Now I only eat meat once a day. But, this was the guy who would eat it twice a day, every day. Wow. So, but Tristram's whole thing is that you've got to make it fun and you've got to make it feel like you're still living. And that is really important because, we are partly where we are because we have created some incredible things and it's human nature to innovate and to grow and to develop. So with Tristram, he organized Feeding the 5,000 quite a few years ago now, maybe 10 years ago, where a huge collective effort, but in a nutshell, he threw a party for 5,000 people in Trafalgar Square in London, where everyone got to eat free food. And the food was made from leftovers and it was cooked by incredible chefs, really well-known chefs, and it tasted delicious. And it was a party. This is what we can do. Saving the world, in inverted commas, does not have to be boring. It doesn't have to be depressing. There are ways around it. And, he goes on to sort of say, I intend to live the good life while fighting the good fight. So he's not going to give up. He's going to carry on, but he's going to find the joy in the day as he does it. And I think that's it's a brilliant line. I've quoted him outside this book so many times. He should probably trademark that.
I think he should.
Yeah, I use it too much, but I do credit him every time. So,
That's fantastic. Have you ever heard of Robert McKee? Robert McKee. He's a very famous professor and speaker who wrote a seminal book called Story. And it's a Bible for people who want to get into the screenwriting business. And I took a seminar with him not long ago. And essentially what he was saying, he said that the core of any story worth telling, there should be a move between values from negative to positive, positive to negative. And there's always a combined set of values. And I think that from what I gather, the one most important thing that came through for me as I read each of these essays, or all of the ones I did read, was this idea that many things are obscure, hidden, and what really we're lacking is the transparency. And sometimes the transparency is simply starts with a conversation. Is this something that rings true to you?
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to what you picked up on earlier about this idea of disconnection. I think part of the reason that we are so disconnected is because we don't see whether it's the human effort or the environmental effort that goes into giving us all the wonderful things that we have. We don't see it. Yeah. So, going back to the example of, food, we don't see the people who are growing it for us. We don't see the amount of water being used to grow it for us. We don't see when it goes wrong, when there are crop failures. We don't see that. We just see the food that is on our plate. And then another example that I use is when we wash our hair, we don't see, or our hair or our clothes, we don't see the tiny microplastics that then go down the drain and into our water systems and into our rivers and out into the sea and back into us again, because our fish are eating it. We're eating the fish. We're seeing evidence now of babies, a fetus, like in their mother's stomachs, that have plastic in them. It's all connected. It's all circular. These things are so transparent, whether literally so in the case of microplastics, or whether just because we either take the trouble or don't think about the fact that there are people and resources being used to make the things that we consume. So I think the two are very closely connected, the disconnection and the obscured and the lack of transparency. I think they're very, very closely linked.
Yeah, there was a passage that in Grow Food, Dismantle the System that I wanted to read. So many actively engaged human hands participate in the systems of growing, producing, processing, packaging, and delivering our food until it's exchanged for money, but we don't see these hands. These processes are obscured on purpose. They're obscured, and it causes the people who do that work to be devalued. They're obscured, and it causes the natural world to be devalued. Learning how to grow food enabled me to see the exploitation behind this curtain in the food system first, but then in everything else. It's very hard for me to concentrate because the kitten was attacking the furry thing on the cat tree next to me. And it's the first time she's been interested in it. And I'm talking to you and she's eating that fiber. And now I'm thinking, what is going in her system? Anyways.
That's a great,
I derail.
It's a great paragraph to pick out because I think it sums it up so perfectly. And that was Claire Ratton. And she summed that up really, really well. And it can be applied to pretty much any aspect of life, whether it's, what your kitten is eating or anything else. We just don't know as much as we should.
Yeah. I'm very grateful she stepped off and now she's behind the computer screen. Now, another line I picked out, which I thought was really powerful, was this: the most sustainable product is the one you already own. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes, we don't need to, we buy a lot, essentially. I think that's what it comes down to. We think we need so much, and we don't. Just use what you've got left in your cupboard. If it's a shampoo, use it until you've finished it. If it's in your fridge, eat everything that's in there first. And that's on a really sort of like immediate and practical level. But the idea behind that is also to think more long term and to actually think before you buy anything. A lot of the problems that we have, and in another essay by J.B. McKinnon, the Canadian author, he talks very much about that and the idea of consumption. Things are relatively cheap for many of us. And I really need to reiterate again who this book is for us, people who have a choice. And I think we are too quick to replace things. I think sometimes we don't see the value in something and we think everything is replaceable. And that's because actually it sort of is, it's all there. But we need to think about what it takes to replace something we already own with a new thing when we don't need that new thing, because a lot has gone into creating that new thing that we don't need. And when you think about it that way, it's crazy. I was looking to buy a swimming costume, so I'm going on holiday, and the one I currently have doesn't really fit me very well. And as someone who has written a book like this, the idea of buying anything sort of now fills me with horror because I have to make sure I make the right choices. And the thing that struck me the most was that I saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of swimming costumes online. And I wasted about 45 minutes of my life scrolling through my phone, trying to find a swimming costume. And I thought, my God, swimming costumes have been produced, and I don't like a single one of them. There is so much out there.
Yep.
Do you know what I did? I put my phone away because I was getting so angry, and I went into my drawer and I got every item of swimwear I own. And it's a surprising amount, given that I felt I needed to buy a new swimming costume.
Uh-huh.
And I tried them all on again. And you know what? They fit okay. And I am a swimmer, so I do have my actual proper swimming costumes where I do proper swimming in. And then I have my beach ones. And you know what? Those beach ones are fine. They're okay.
Yeah.
I have not bought a new one. So I think...
It's interesting you should mention that, because I actually wrote about, following an article I saw in, I think it was in Vogue Business, I wrote about in my weekly newsletter about the difficulty around swimwear. Now, personally, swimwear, once it's out of shape and is sagging around the bottom, and I have big double D breasts. So when it no longer holds, it's not a possibility.
Yeah.
But I realized all of the difficulties of finding something that fitted and also that was ethically in my wheelhouse. And you are right. There are millions of pieces of swimwear that one of my favorite people, who is a very engaged, active person called Eva Geraldine Fontanelli, who has a beautiful website and movement called Gooders. She said, you know, the most sustainable thing is something beautiful that you're going to keep forever. And so for those of us who are making the choice of buying a new piece of swimwear, just remember, just make sure that this is something that you really, really, really love and will treat really well, so it lasts as long as possible. Because I think that sometimes it's also how we care for the items that we already have that will give them the lasting life that they could have, whether it's in our cupboards or somewhere else. But I wanted to segue for a second and talk about repairs, because I've seen that the rise of repairs is something that is becoming interesting in and around luxury fashion, and something that I'm not seeing a lot of pickup on in my corner of the world in Switzerland. But I know that there are a number of interesting startups in the UK that are looking at this, because conscious consumers don't want to throw stuff away. But sometimes the problem is, how do you get stuff fixed? And I know that this is one of the ways that we can really sort of extend the life of what we own and stop this constant consumer cycle.
Definitely. And also and people might be surprised about this, as you know, as a fashion journalist for 15 years, I actually hate shopping. Oh God, I love nice clothes. I do. I like clothes that fit well and look great, but my God, I hate shopping.
Totally.
So the idea that I've got something in my wardrobe that I know looks good and fits me, has a hole in it, if I can get that fixed instead of having to start the process again, I mean, that to me, that's a no-brainer, because then I don't have to go shopping. So I found a local tailor. And that's the thing as well. Like, I think they're around more than you think. So to give you an example, like, you know, I can't fight off every trend. And I really wanted to buy into the miniskirt trend this season, because I think it's nice in the summer, especially like when you can wear flat shoes. And I thought, but you know, I've just written a book about not buying stuff, so I'm not going to go and buy a miniskirt because I don't need one. It's just, you know, a whim. So I was going through my wardrobe and I had this A-line suede skirt that I haven't worn for about 10 years. Mm-hmm. And I put it on and I got like some hairpins and I started sort of pinning it up to see what it might look like if I got it shortened. I thought, this looks nice. So I sent a message to a local WhatsApp group of local friends. And I said, does anyone know a good tailor? Everyone came back with suggestions. So I took this skirt down the road and he shortened it for me. And now I have a mini skirt that I can wear, which I really like. Let's hope I don't then want to, don't want it to be A-line again, because I can't go back. But that was really nice, because I felt like I got a new item of clothing without actually having to shop for it.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, because there's one shirt dress I own that felt right when I lived in Rome, but now in Geneva, I don't know, there's something about it that's not quite right. It's too long, the sleeves or something. And so I've just got this new dry cleaner and they have a great seamstress. And I think I'm going to take it there so she can change the collar and change the sleeves and perhaps take in the length as well. And then this will become something I'm going to use all the time. But right now, as it is, it's just not getting airtime outside of my cupboard.
What? You should follow that instinct, because I am doing the same thing with a shirt dress myself. It's just not the right length. I haven't taken it to have it changed yet, but I will do. And it is a shirt dress and it's something to do with the length. So we're on the same wavelength here.
Yeah, there was one other example that came to mind for me around furniture, because I think that one of the pieces that you talk about as well is value that comes through a lot throughout the book, and are missing the value of the things that we own because of the way that they've been produced. And we don't understand the price when it's low. And a lot of people don't understand the price when it's high, because we've lost this connection with who makes things, how are they made with, how much time does it take? And so for as long as I remember, my dad had this broken armchair in his study. And it was his dad's armchair. And it was broken. And it was kind of nice. And it remained broken until I moved here.
Really?
And I just thought, I've moved around a lot. And I've actually taken all my furniture with me. From London to New York to Paris to Rome to Geneva. Some of it did not enjoy all of the travel. And so they need a bit of TLC. They need a bit of care and repair. After a couple of things were broken, I was put in touch by the insurance company and the movers to, let's say, a specialist that can repair things. And I can't do it all because it would be a lot of money to get everything fixed exactly and put back in the right condition. But I started where I could. And sure, I could have bought a whole bunch of chairs if I'd gone to IKEA instead of repairing this one wooden and leather armchair. It's now in my office. It looks beautiful. And I think that I can invest every year in getting one piece restored or fixed up here and there. And it feels wonderful.
It does, doesn't it? And then you
by the way, I did put a bit of time and effort trying to figure out, like, where could I buy another chair? How much money would it be to get the same one? And actually, I could get a cheap chair, but an equivalent to this would have set me back quite a lot of money.
So you feel pride, don't you, in restoring it as well? And there's a story behind it there. It's nice.
Yeah. But on the other hand, for people who say, oh, my couch is, falling apart. The difficulty is I had an upholsterer give me an appraisal, and I could buy 2 sets of sofas for the money that he quoted me. So I had to get clever and find other ways to clean it and to get rid of the evidence of a cat having clawed its way through it. Anyways, as you said, when we have constraints, we can get creative. But I think that understanding the value of how things are made is something we can get in contact with when we try to repair them, because we see the cost of the repair. And that hints at the cost of making it, the actual value of making it in the first place. Now, in one of the essays called We Are the Weather that you mentioned before, there was a sentence that gave us the etymology of the word crisis, which comes from Greek. I love linguistics too. And in Greek, krisis, I'm going to try to give the accent, means decision. And later you quoted one of my favorite writers, Yuval Noah Harari, who said in one of his books that most human decisions are based on emotional reactions. And I'd go further and saying that we are emotional beings who rationalize our emotional choices. How can we get people to feel more connected?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I am sort of reminded back to when, you gave the example again of them eating meat and 2 veg every day. And I said, cook him a brilliant vegetarian dinner. it's hard to fabricate an emotional connection. It's hard to do that. And I think what I have felt is the more you do, the more you feel that the more sort of action you take, the more you are willing to sort of engage in the bigger efforts of what needs to be done. I think that many of us will feel this a lot more when I talk about this, the climate and the ecological crisis. I think we are learning more and more about it, and we are making more and more connections between the scale of the problem, how it impacts us, and what we can do about it. And I think that every small step someone takes leads to something bigger. So I think that is a way that we are going to feel it more, because we are going to learn more about it and make those connections. But I think, how do we feel more? How do we get those emotions more? That's know that I know the answer to that. I guess that's why I've written this book, and why I have spoken to 21 people and not 2 people. Why I've chosen for these 21 very different people to tell very different stories. And, stories that, whilst they might be peppered with facts and statistics, are actually very personal in one way or another, or are very emotive, or bring certain things to life, or transport you somewhere. That's why I wanted to do it that way, because if you don't have, as in my case, if you don't have a daughter who has asthma, and you're worried that part of the reason for that is how much we drive, or if you don't sit in front of the TV and feel something when you're watching the country that you used to live in be burnt down, then I'm hoping, I don't know, my very, very small contribution is to create a book that tells stories that hopefully will resonate with people and drive them to action.
Thank you so much. I remember that the first time we talked, you were touched by a story. I wonder if that was from that group, Mums for Lungs.
That's
about
right, yeah.
a little girl whose life was lost. Am I correct?
She from Mums for Lungs. The mother lives very locally. She lives down the road from me. Yes, so her daughter, Ella, died 8 years ago from, so to give context to the story,
sure.
that her little girl had asthma and suffered severely from it. And Rosamond, her mother, believed that it was linked to the fact that they lived off the South Circular, which is a road in southwest London that regularly breaches safe levels of air pollution. And Rosamond was convinced that the two were linked. And she fought tirelessly and campaigned for that link to be acknowledged and then acted upon. And she eventually won landmark hearing that said that, yes, air pollution contributed to her daughter's death. They made the link between the number of times that Ella went to hospital with an asthma attack to peaks in air pollution in coming off that road, and those two measurements matched up. And so Ella is, at the time of speaking, the only person in the world to have air pollution listed on her death certificate. And I think if that doesn't move someone to action, then, well, I think you need to look inside yourself a little bit.
So the same guy that I mentioned before, Jensi Strickler, he had founded a group called the Bento Society. And so we were working on a weekly basis as little groups and doing exercises to work on ourselves so that we would make better decisions for what he called now me, now us, future me, future us, right? And to have that contact with what he called Bento, so beyond near term, so that we would see a better 2050. And I remember there was one exercise that I felt a little bit disconnected to originally, which had to do with understanding or connecting with our ancestors. And I note the last line of your book in Transform is be a good ancestor. Leave the world in a better place than you found it. And strangely, whilst I don't find that I have a strong sense of connection with my own ancestors, asking me to consider how to be a good ancestor is something that I find actually motivating. How would I like people to remember my contribution on this planet?
Yeah.
Maybe it's egotistic, but suddenly it feels personal.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that you say that it's not necessarily a direct connection to your own ancestors, but a much bigger thing. And I actually think that's way more powerful and where that saying comes from. So it's the last essay in Transform is by Jennifer Martell, who is the co-founder of Indigenous Peoples Movement. She lives in an Indigenous tribe between North and South Dakota. And that is what they live by. And it's not necessarily about, certainly you don't have to see it as being in bloodlines. It's much more about, because we're all living in one place, it's one planet and we're all inheriting it and passing it on. So I actually think the fact that you feel that way is so lovely, because that is much more powerful. Yeah. And it's, and I think I say this in the book, maybe in my conclusion, that if there is one thing that you do from the one thing that you take away from the book, it's that one, because if you can be a good ancestor, then you're pretty much doing everything.
Cool. I mean, okay, so I got it then.
Yeah.
We're going to come to a close because I have some more questions that I like to ask all my guests, but I want to ask you two more questions. I'm sure you've got feedback from people who've read your book already and perhaps friends and family. So do you see anything in specific that you think can move people to action? I'm just curious for a reader who's thinking, yeah, well, if I read a book, is that really going to move me to do anything?
Right. Okay. So two things. The first one, if you had sort of feedback from readers, something that people have been speaking to me about, which they said, I didn't know this, was the essay around beauty care, or not beauty, like personal care around shampoo and moisturizer and hair gels, everything like that. How people are just not aware of the things in our everyday products. So lots of people have come to me and said, I didn't know that my conditioner was problematic. We often tend to think about packaging when it comes to stuff like that, but it's actually the ingredients in there. And they are relatively small changes we can make. Although, going back to the emotional stuff, we do care about the shampoo that well, not all of us, but lots of us do kind of care about the shampoo and the moisturizer that we use. So it can be a bit of a leap to change. But then you are sending a message back to that brand that they need to make changes.
Yeah. That's such a good point. Yeah.
And the other one that I think that there is a sort of a criticism that I completely take on board and agree with is that how can I really make a difference with a simple action? That's just, you can't simplify a problem that's so big. Well, if we all changed our banks collectively, we would make one hell of a difference. So unless obviously you already bank with an ethical bank, but I banked with my bank for about 20 years, not thinking, not caring, not knowing about what they did with my money. And then I spoke to Alistair Roxburgh from Friends of the Earth for the book, and he painted a very vivid picture. So yeah, if maybe I could sort of send, I mean, I don't know if that's the right way of putting it, because I think all the essays are important, but money matters. We know that. And if we together could come, if we could come together and change that, changing who you bank with, that's what I would say.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And so finally, why 3 things? Because, so when I was learning how to become a journalist, like my first job anyway at Drapers, I kept being told about the rule of 3. So I was a news reporter and I broke stories, and my news editor said, it's not a story until you can get 3 reliable sources to corroborate. So you need 3. And then obviously, as a fashion journalist, I wrote about trends. So unless you see it at least 3 times, it's not a trend. So it's that. And then I started thinking about the rule of 3, and you think about like in storytelling, and you've got
the Three Little Pigs. You've got Three Billy Goats Gruff. There is something manageable about three. It's doable. You know, I'm not going to, here is 1,227 things you can do.
Oh, come on.
You know, three is repetitive. We use it in writing, you know, when you think about sort of making an impact in your writing and you get the staccato like sentences and you do three things and you can't do two because it's not quite enough. You do four and you lose people. So you need three. It's more of a sort of writing technique.
I understand. Thank you so much for indulging me.
Thank you for asking.
Before we go to my closing questions, is there anything else you would like to add that we haven't covered? Because I could have two on the Zoom for the next 6 hours easily.
Oh gosh, I think we have covered it all. And I think you've asked some really insightful questions that, you know, really made me sort of think again and showed me how actually the work is never done. So I know I've written this book, but it keeps going, you know, like there's more to learn. And that should be an exciting thing, you know, that's
perhaps the most important thing that you can do. And it's not something that I would normally say to people is promote the book. Now is the most important part. You've done such a great piece of work. And I say this to the listeners, knowing I've only read half of the book. But the first half has left me profoundly moved and challenged. And yes, friends and family, you will all get a copy. But now, if I can say anything that I want you to feel from me is go and talk about it. Let's make people read this, because we can see in these pages that individual action matters. Every time that we feel disconnected and that we sense that we have no power, we are wrong. We have power. Every small decision, every small choice that we can make can move the needle.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that. And you know, that is the impact that I wanted the book to have. So it's you know, just so lovely to hear you say it. Thank you.
Oh, I'm convinced. All right. So now on to other matters.
Okay.
What is your favorite word and one that you could tattoo on yourself?
Oh, as a writer, I do get asked that. What's my favorite word? And I don't have one. I'm loath to sort of make one up just for the sake of answering the question. I can't give you a word, but I can give you a type of word. So I love verbs. I am completely obsessed with them. When I write, I will agonize over a single sentence because I'm trying to find the right verb. And I don't know whether that comes from my background as a journalist. I don't know whether that comes from the writers I admire who are quite economical with language. But I just think if you have the right verb, you can do away with a lot of adjectives, with unnecessary words. So is that an annoying answer for you?
No answer is annoying.
Okay.
This is just, I'm trying to ask these to understand the breadth of difference and the commonalities that we all have with each other.
All right.
That's why I like to ask the same questions at the end.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. And I feel like I'm always surprised by what people choose. And I like to be surprised.
Oh, good.
So because the podcast, like me, is at the crossroads between business and mindfulness, can you tell me about what mindful rituals, what keeps you grounded, what keeps you balanced, and what works for you?
Swimming. I swim a lot. I'm going now after this interview. I've booked a slot in the outdoor pool. Running. Weirdly, I'm a terrible runner, but I do it because it's easy. I just can walk out of the door and run. And it's an incredible, I don't like saying it out loud in case I jinx it one day, but it's a really good problem solver. If I'm struggling with writing a sentence or an angle to take on a piece of work, I go for a run and 8 times out of 10, I come back with the answer. And my family, really, ultimately, that's what matters. When things get really, really hard, provided that they're here and they're with me and they're safe, that helps.
What is the sweetest thing that's ever happened to you?
Okay, so my now husband, but when we first started going out, he encouraged me to become a journalist. I was still working in PR at the time, knowing I wanted to be a journalist, but not really doing anything about it. He bought me a notebook, a leather-bound notebook, and he, on the very first page, he wrote out an Ernest Hemingway quote. Actually, don't remember it word for word. It's a little bit chunky, but it's a quote that he says, find the emotion, find what it was that gave you the emotion, and then write it down. And I always think about it, and it's just that simplicity. We're so, I don't know, I think we sort of try to use the language a bit too much. As in we get a bit caught up in long, fancy words. And there was something so lovely and simple. And I'm a writer now, and I wasn't until he gave me that book. So I think there's a lot to be said for that.
For sure. Thank you so much. What is a secret superpower that you have? Oh, and before you answer, I want to tell you, I don't know if you remember, but Freddie, our common friend, Freda.
Oh, yeah.
Her secret superpower is to make a meal out of nothing, which I think is very in line with your book.
Yeah, that is good. That is, and I can vouch for that as well, I'm sure. Not vouch for it, I don't think she's ever made that for me, but I can see that she could do that. My superpower, oh gosh, I can write anywhere. I can write standing up on a packed, loud train, and I can write for you.
That is a pretty strong superpower. What is a favorite book that you can share with us?
One favorite book. I'm going to say Catch-22 because it's the book that I remember thinking about it in terms of how it was written. I think I read it when I was 14, and it was the first time I considered a book for its writing and what it was doing to me rather than just consuming it.
Fantastic. Thank you. Where is somewhere you visited that you felt really had an impact on who you are today?
I remember when I went back to Brazil, actually, with my husband. We were going out at the time, and it was the first time I'd gone back without the rest of my family. And we went just the two of us, and I hadn't been back for a long time. And I felt, it might sound a bit, I don't know, like cheesy, but it felt quite Proustian, like the smells and the senses. And I really felt a connection, a sensual connection to a place, which I don't think I had before.
Last but not least, my favorite question. What brings you happiness?
Seeing my daughter sit on my husband's lap. They look like a delicious sort of shade of caramel. They're the same colouring. Hitting a really good forehand. Doesn't happen very often, but when I do, it's really good. And dipping my head underwater. Just being with my family. That's it.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you, Rhea. Connected to hitting that forehand. I'll think of you next time I hit one.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the time that you've given me today. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. I mean, since the first day that we had a chance to exchange, I felt such a kinship, and I am in awe of the book and what you've started with it. It's truly wonderful. And I hope that our conversation today will encourage people to get it, knowing that we don't have to do everything, but that we can get inspired and also let things percolate and see. We don't need to know everything and get everything right now. But hopefully there's going to be seeds planted, positive seeds of change. And
thank you so much.
I invite everyone to go and buy the book. Where can people find you if they'd like to connect with you, find more about what else you've done and the other book that we've never talked about actually over the course of this interview?
Well, I have a website, Ana-Santi.com. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Twitter. You can always email me. Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. I will put all of the links in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you so much, Anna. Have a wonderful rest of your day and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really humbled to be asked. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks again to Anna for being my guest on the show today. As always, you can find the relevant links of what we talked about in the show notes. So friends and listeners, thank you again for joining me. If you'd like to hear more, you can subscribe to the show on the platform of your choice. If you'd like to connect, you can get in touch with me at AnneV on Twitter or Anne Muhlethaler on LinkedIn and @_out of the clouds on Instagram, where I also share daily musings about mindfulness. You can find all of the episodes of the podcast and more on my website, annevmuhlethaler.com. And if you don't know how to spell it, that's also in the show notes. To get regular news direct to your inbox, I invite you to sign up to my monthly newsletter. So that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening to Out of the Clouds. I hope that you'll join me again next time. Until then, be well, be safe, and take care.